The morning August Wilcox rode his dusty roan horse up to the split-rail fence of the Talbot property. The sun was barely 2 fingers above the eastern ridge, and Helen Talbot was already bleeding from a gash on her palm, where a rusted nail had caught her while she was trying to fix what 3 days of hard wind had torn apart. She did not hear him coming at first. The wind was still active enough to carry sound away from her, and she was focused on the fence board she was pressing back into place with her good hand, the other wrapped in the hem of her apron to slow the bleeding. The roan's hooves in the dry summer earth of 1882 made a muffled rhythm that only reached her ears when the horse stopped entirely, and she looked up to find a stranger watching her from the other side of the fence with calm, dark eyes and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps a week. He was not an old man. She placed him somewhere near 30, maybe a year or two on either side. His hat was brown and had been rained on enough times that the brim curved unevenly, and the coat he wore over his canvas shirt was the color of tobacco. His horse stood still beneath him, with the patient ease of an animal accustomed to long silences. He looked at her hand wrapped in the apron, then at the broken fence board, then at her face, and then he asked his question. "You want help with that?" It was not the question she expected. She had grown accustomed to men on horses stopping at her fence for other reasons, to tell her the bank wanted its answer by month's end, or to ask if she had seen cattle with a particular brand, or twice in the past year to try to buy the property out from under her with a figure that was insultingly low. She had not been asked a simple, direct, and genuinely offered question like that in long enough that it took her a moment to process it. She looked at him steadily. The bleeding was not slowing. "That depends," she said, "on whether you can drive a nail straight." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the beginning of one. "I can drive a nail straight," he said. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, looped his reins over the one post that was still standing solid, and walked toward the gap in the fence like he had done it 100 times on 100 different properties. He held out his hand for the board she was pressing against the rail, and she gave it to him. "You have a hammer?" he asked. "On the porch, nails too, bucket on the left side of the door." He walked to her porch without hesitation, found the bucket, came back with the hammer and a fistful of nails held between 2 fingers. He pressed the board against the rail with his knee to keep it steady, positioned a nail at the corner and drove it clean with 4 even strokes. Helen watched him. She unwrapped her apron hem and looked at the cut. It was shallow, more messy than serious. She pressed the cloth back against it and kept watching. He drove a second nail, then moved to the other end of the board and did the same. "What brings you through here?" she asked. It was a practical question. This was Colfax County, New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1882, and a man riding alone through ranch land was either moving between towns, working for someone, running from something, or looking for work. Those were roughly the 4 categories, and she had learned to sort men into them quickly. "Heading south," he said. "Came up through Colorado, followed the Cimarron south. Heard there's work in Lincoln County." "There's trouble in Lincoln County," she said. "That too," he agreed, and drove another nail. She appreciated that he did not try to dispute it or minimize it. The Lincoln County troubles had been dying down since 1881, but the reputation of the place still traveled, and a man who acknowledged truth plainly without flinching was already more interesting to her than most. "There's also work here," she said before she had fully decided to say it. He stopped, looked at her over his shoulder. "Here being your property." "Here being the Talbot Ranch, which is 1,040 acres, 200 of it currently ungrazed because I don't have enough hands to work it. A herd of 63 cattle that should be closer to 120 by this time of year. A roof with a section that let water in all through June, and a fence line that is apparently longer than I can maintain alone." She said it plainly, without self-pity, because it was simply the state of things, and she had never seen the value in softening facts. He turned fully to face her now. "You run this place alone." "I run this place," she said. "Whether alone or not has varied." He looked at the land around them. The house was solid. Her father had built it well in 1863 when he'd first settled the territory. But it showed the particular kind of wear that comes not from neglect, but from one person trying to do the work of three. The fence line stretched away in both directions in varying states of repair. The barn needed paint on its east-facing boards. The kitchen garden near the house was well tended, bright with summer greens, which told him she was not a woman without discipline or care. She had simply run out of hours in the day. "What does the work pay?" he asked. "Room, board, and fair wages. $8 a month if you stay through the fall roundup. 10 if you're still here come the first snow and the herd is where it ought to be." He considered this. She could see him weighing it against wherever he had been going, which was south and uncertain. "August Wilcox," he said, and extended his hand. She took it with her uninjured one. "Helen Talbot." "I'll take the work, Miss Talbot," he said, "on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. "You let me finish this fence before I start anything else. It bothers me to leave a job half done." She looked at the fence, then back at him, and for the first time in a long time something in her chest loosened by a small but noticeable degree. "That," she said, "is the most acceptable condition I have heard in years." The first week was professional and careful, the way two strangers sharing a workspace learn to move around each other without collision. August slept in the bunkhouse, which she had not needed to call a bunkhouse since her last two hands had left in March, one for a silver strike near Taos that everyone told him would not pan out, and the other simply without explanation one morning, his bunk empty and his horse gone. She had not wasted much emotion on either departure because grief was a luxury that ranching in the New Mexico Territory in 1882 did not often permit. August rose before her most mornings. She discovered this on the second day when she came out to the yard to find the water troughs already filled and the horses in the paddock already fed. She stood in the cool of the early morning looking at the troughs for a moment, then went back inside and said nothing about it, because saying something would have made it a conversation about what she noticed about him, and she was not ready for that kind of conversation yet. He was efficient in a way that was not hurried. He worked with a measured steadiness that covered a great deal of ground without appearing to rush. By the end of the first week, he had repaired every section of the east fence line, patched the roof over the kitchen with cedar shingles. He cut himself from a half-rotted post he found in the barn that still had good wood in its center, and relocated 3 sections of cattle that had drifted into the eastern pasture, where the grass was already grazed thin. She watched all of this from appropriate distances and told herself she was supervising, which was true, and told herself that was the only reason she watched, which was less true. On the 8th evening, she made supper for 2 instead of 1 without making a decision about it, simply doing it in the same way she had been making her father's supper, alongside her own for so many years, that the motion of setting 2 plates was almost more natural than setting 1. She called out from the porch that there was food inside when she heard him crossing the yard from the barn, and he came in and sat at the table with his hat in his hands, and she placed a plate of salt pork, boiled potatoes, and cornbread in front of him, and he said thank you with a sincerity that was quiet and genuine. They ate mostly in silence, but it was not uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who do not feel the need to fill air with words merely because the air is there. "Where are you from originally?" she asked when the bread was half gone. "Missouri," he said. "Caldwell County. Long way from home. It's been a long time since I'd call it home." He said it without apparent sadness, just as a fact of geography and time. "My father's farm, 2 brothers, I left at 22. That was 9 years ago. So he was 31. She was 28. She filed these numbers away without examining too closely why she wanted to know them. "Why did you leave?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might not answer, which would have been his right, but he did. "My father and I disagreed about most things," he said. "How to treat the land, how to treat the people who worked it. When a man keeps telling you that you're wrong about everything important, eventually you either become him or you leave." He paused. "I left. And your brothers stayed, became him or near enough." He picked up his cornbread. What about you? This was your father's land. My father and mother came out from Tennessee in 1863. I was 9 years old. My mother died of fever in 1871. My father ran the ranch until 1878 when he had a fall from a horse that broke his hip badly enough that he couldn't do the heavy work anymore. He passed in March of 1880. I'm sorry, August said. He had a good life and he knew it, she said. He used to say that the land was worth whatever it cost to hold it. I believe he was right. She looked at the table. I have had moments of doubting it this year. She had not said that out loud before, not to anyone. She was not entirely sure why she said it now, to a man she had known for 8 days. Perhaps it was because he was a man she had known for only 8 days, which meant the scales of judgment between them were still uncalibrated, and she was not yet performing for his benefit. Why this year particularly? He asked. The bank in Cimarron. There is a man named Delwood Pratt who holds a note my father took out in 1877 to buy breeding stock. My father paid it down to a manageable amount, but the year he died there were bad losses, and the note grew again. Pratt has been patient is not the right word. Strategic. He extends, then tightens, then extends again. He wants the land. He has wanted it since before my father died because the northeast pasture sits on a creek that runs year-round, which makes it worth considerably more than the rest. How much do you owe him? She looked at him directly. That is a personal question. I know, he said. I'm asking because I'd like to understand what I'm working in the middle of, not because it's my business what you owe. She considered that distinction and found it legitimate. $420, she said. Due in full by October 15th. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing the arithmetic of wages and time and probability the same way she had been doing it for months. Is there a way to make the payment? He asked. The fall roundup. If I bring the herd to its proper size and get fair prices at the San Miguel market, I can come close. If prices are good and I'm not short on cattle, I can make it. She paused. There are a lot of conditions in that sentence. There are, he agreed, but they're not impossible ones. No, she said, they are not. She took the plates to the basin and he stood and put on his hat and said good night, and she said the same. And after the door closed behind him, she stood at the basin for a while looking at the wall in front of her, thinking about the fact that she had told this man, this stranger, still essentially more about her difficulties in one supper than she had told her nearest neighbor, Clara Briggs, in the entire previous year. She turned back to the basin and began washing up and told herself that it was simply because he was an employee and employees needed context to do their work well, and this explanation was practical and sensible and almost entirely dishonest. By the third week, there was a rhythm to their days that felt less constructed and more grown, the way a path forms not by design but by repeated walking. He took the north pasture in the mornings, and she worked the south, and they met at the barn at noon, where she kept a cooler that held lunch wrapped in cloth, and they would eat sitting on the fence or on the ground depending on whether there was shade, and talk about the work in a way that gradually included more things that were not strictly the work. She learned that he had spent 2 years in Kansas working cattle drives up the Kishom Trail, and another year in Colorado at a mining camp, not as a miner, but as a man who supplied the miners with horses and equipment. And before that a period he described only as wandering that she understood without needing. It explained to mean that he had been finding his footing after leaving Missouri and had taken some time to find it. He learned that she had had a husband briefly, a man named Thomas Birch who had come through in 1876 when she was 22 and her father was still strong and the ranch was running well. And she had married him in a ceremony in Cimarron with 30 people present and a fiddle player who knew 8 songs and played them all twice. Thomas had been a good man, she said, and she meant it without the particular hesitation that would have suggested otherwise, which August noted. He had died of typhoid in the autumn of 1877, 14 months after the wedding, before any children came. I'm sorry, August said when she told him. They were sitting on the fence rail that ran along the north side of the barn, eating cold biscuits and dried beef. I was too, she said, for a long time. Then I had to stop being sorry and start being a rancher, and that helped. She looked at the northern pasture where the cattle were moving slowly through the good grass. The work helps. It does, he agreed with a certainty that came from personal knowledge. There was a pause, and then she said, "Do you mind me asking what you are running from, August?" She used his first name without having made a decision to, and he noticed. And she noticed that he noticed, and neither of them commented on it. "What makes you think I'm running from something?" he asked. "A man who is simply moving toward a destination rides with more direction than you did when you stopped at my fence," she said. "You were not riding like a man who had somewhere to be. You were riding like a man who wanted to put distance between himself and somewhere he had been." He was quiet for a moment. A crow called from the tree line to the east, and a calf in the north pasture answered it with a bewildered sound that made her lips press together briefly to suppress a smile. "I was in Denver," he said finally. "There was a woman. I thought it was going to be one thing. It turned out to be something else. When it ended, I needed to be somewhere that was not Denver." Helen nodded. She did not press because she understood that sometimes a complete answer is not the same as the most useful answer, and what she had was complete enough. "Did she hurt you?" Helen asked. It was a direct question and she knew it, but she had found that direct questions usually deserve to be asked. "She did," he said. "Not maliciously. She just wanted different things than I did, and she took a while to tell me so." He picked up his water canteen. "I am not still in love with her, if that is what you are trying to determine." "I was not trying to determine anything," Helen said. "Yes, you were," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth moved all the way into a smile, and she felt it land somewhere below her sternum with a warmth that surprised her. She looked away at the pasture. "Fine," she said. "I was trying to determine it." They sat with that admission between them in the afternoon heat, and the cattle moved through the grass, and neither of them moved to change the subject, and neither of them needed to. The trouble with Delwood Pratt arrived in the flesh on a Thursday afternoon in early August, 3.5 weeks after August Wilcox had come to the ranch. He came in a buggy with 2 men on horseback flanking him, which was the kind of entrance a man makes when he wants to remind you of the size of the forces at his disposal, without making it explicitly threatening enough to constitute a legal grievance. Helen saw the dust of them coming from the west, and knew what it was before she could identify the individual riders. She took off her work gloves and folded them and put them in her apron pocket, and stood in the yard with her hands visible and her posture straight. August came out of the barn when he heard the buggy and stood a few feet behind her and to her right. He did not make a show of it. He simply stood there in the way of a man who is present and paying attention. Pratt was 53 years old and had the well-fed look of a man who had not missed a meal in 20 years. He was not physically imposing. He was shorter than average and wide through the middle, but he carried authority, the way a man does when he has enough money that other people have been agreeing with him for decades. His 2 riders stayed back when he climbed down from the buggy. "Miss Talbot," he said, with the particular brand of courtesy that does not mean courtesy, "I hope the season is treating you well." "It's treating me fine," she said. "Mr. Pratt." He glanced at August with a brief calculating look. "I've come as a matter of good faith," Pratt said, "to let you know that my patience has limits, and October 15th is not a date that I am able to extend further. I have extended 3 times in the past 2 years, and a bank is not a charity." "I'm aware of that," Helen said. "I intend to make the payment." "That is admirable," he said, in a tone that managed to imply that admirable intentions and actual outcomes were 2 different categories of thing, which they sometimes were, and the fact that he was right did not make the tone less insufferable. "I also want to make you an offer. Not as the holder of your note, but as a buyer in good faith. I will offer you $1,800 for the property, clear the note, and leave you with nearly $1,400 to start elsewhere." Helen looked at him steadily. "The property is worth more than that." "To whom?" he asked. "You've been running short-handed for over a year. The herd is under what it should be. The fencing has been in various states of disrepair. The roof, the roof has been repaired, she said. He glanced at August again. I can see you found some help. That is good for you. But help is expensive, and October is not far, and I am offering you a clean exit from a situation that has been, by all accounts, a difficult one for you. What you are offering me, Helen said, is a price that would give me enough to survive for 1 or 2 years and nothing to build on. This land was my father's. I've worked it since I was 9 years old. I intend to keep working it. Pratt looked at her with an expression that combined genuine respect for her stubbornness with genuine irritation at it. October 15th, he said. $420, that is my position. I know your position, she said. You will have your payment. He climbed back into his buggy with the deliberate movements of a man who does not hurry because he has decided already that time is on his side. He turned the buggy without further words, and his 2 riders followed him back toward the road. Helen stood watching the dust diminish. She heard August move to stand beside her. How far short are you, realistically? He said. She was quiet for a moment. At current prices and current herd size, I'm looking at 340, maybe 360 at the San Miguel market. If I can get 80 head to market, I'm there. Right now I have 63, 17 cattle short. What would it take to get 17 more? 2 of my cows are close to calving. That's 2, maybe 3 if one of them is carrying twins, which I believe the spotted one might be. The rest would need to come from somewhere. She was thinking aloud, which she rarely did in front of anyone. There is a man named Ray's in the valley south of August who sometimes has young stock to sell at reasonable rates. If I rode down there by next week, I might be able to get 8 or 10 head for something I could afford. What could you afford? Maybe $50. 60 if I use what I've set aside for the winter supply run and make the supply run smaller. That's a risk, he said. Everything is a risk, she said. That's the one I'm looking at. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have $62 in my saddlebags. She turned to look at him. I'm not taking your money, she said. It's not charity, he said. I'll put it in as a share. If the cattle sell well enough to make the payment and leave anything over, I get my $62 back plus whatever percentage of the surplus corresponds to the investment. If there's nothing left over, I consider it part of the wages arrangement. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her with an expression that was simply honest and patient, not trying to be anything other than what it was. That is a very poor investment structure, she said. I'm aware of that. Why would you do that? He held her gaze. Because I would like this ranch to stay your ranch, he said, and I would like to still be working on it come winter. The way he said it was simple, and it was more than simple, and she understood both layers of it simultaneously, and something in her chest moved in a way it had not moved in a long time. She looked back toward the road where Pratt's dust had gone. I'll ride to August on Monday, she said. I'll come with you, he said. 4 eyes on cattle are better than 2. Monday then, she said. They turned and went back to their respective work, and the afternoon continued around them as if nothing had changed, and something had changed, and they both knew it. The ride to August took most of Monday. The country south of the ranch shifted from the open grassland of the Cimarron Valley into the rougher terrain near the mountains, where the road narrowed and the cottonwood trees along the creek bottoms turned the light green and filtered. August rode beside her on the roan, and her horse was a solid blue roan mare named Clara, after her neighbor, which the neighbor did not know and would not have minded. They talked more on that ride than they had in all the previous weeks combined. Not about the ranch or the cattle or Delwood Pratt, but about things further back and deeper. He told her about Missouri in winter, the way the fields looked under snow, and how he had loved that particular silence as a child before the particular unhappiness of his father's house had overwritten most of his early memories. She told him about Tennessee, which she barely remembered. She had been 5 when her family left, but her mother had described it often enough that she had a collection of second-hand images. Rolling green hills, a different quality of rain, and peach trees that her mother said produced fruit so sweet it was almost wrong. She missed it, Helen said. Tennessee. I don't think she ever stopped missing it, even though she loved what my father was building out here. You can love where you are and still carry a homesickness for somewhere else. You can, August said. Do you carry that? She thought about it. No, I think I'm one of those people who was made for where she landed, the dry summers and the wide sky. The way the mountains look in the evening when the sun goes behind them. This is my place. She paused. What about you? I don't know yet, he said. I think I've been moving long enough that I've forgotten how to know when I'm somewhere that fits. It's like you know how when you've been in the saddle for 10 or 12 hours, your body forgets what it feels like to stand still. I think I've been moving so long I've forgotten what it feels like to stop. She looked at him. He was looking at the road ahead, his profile against the bright morning sky. What does it feel like? She asked quietly. Here, I mean, on the ranch. He turned to look at her and she did not look away, and neither did he. It feels like standing still, he said. For the first time in a while. She turned back to the road, and the warmth she felt was not from the summer sun. Ray's had 11 head of young stock, 7 of them strong enough that August evaluated them quietly and efficiently, checking legs and teeth and temperament in the manner of a man who had spent years working cattle and knew exactly what he was looking for. Helen negotiated with Ray's in a Spanish that was functional and direct. She had learned it over 20 years of living in the territory, and she was proud of how far it had come from her early stumbling attempts. Ray's was a round-faced man of perhaps 55 with quick eyes and a genuine smile, and he took her measure in about 30 seconds and decided he respected her, which she could tell because his price became more reasonable on the second exchange and not the fifth. They came to an agreement on 9 head for $58, which took August's contribution and the last of what she had in the tin behind the kitchen stove, and she felt the particular nervous satisfaction of a gamble committed to. The drive back north with the 9 cattle was slower, as cattle drives always are, and they made camp for the night on a flat piece of ground above a creek bend, where the cottonwoods were thick enough to provide shelter if the wind picked up after dark. August built the fire, and she unpacked the food she'd brought, and they cooked over the open flame in the long-shadowed evening, while the cattle settled on the grass beyond the firelight. After supper, they sat by the fire with their coffee, and the sky above them opened up in the way that it does in the high desert of New Mexico territory in summer, the stars appearing in their thousands with a clarity that is almost difficult to look at for long. "Do you still think about Denver?" she asked. She asked it without preamble because that was her way, and he had come to understand that her directness was not aggression but simply a form of respect. She asked what she meant and meant what she said and did not believe in managing people through indirection. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I did. What do you think about instead?" He was quiet for a moment, and when he turned to look at her across the fire, the light moved over his face in a way that made him look both younger and more serious than usual. "About whether I'm doing justice to what I've found here," he said. "About whether I'm the kind of man who is capable of staying somewhere when the somewhere becomes important to him." He paused. "I want to be. I'm not entirely certain yet that I am." "Honest answer," she said. "You wouldn't accept any other kind," he said. "No," she agreed. "I wouldn't." The fire settled between them with a sound of shifting wood, and the creek made its low, constant sound, and she thought about what he had said, about the question of whether a person is capable of the thing that they want to be capable of. She had asked herself that question many times in the years since Thomas died and her father's health failed, and the ranch became entirely hers to hold. She had not always been certain of the answer, but she had always kept going, which she supposed was an answer of its own. "You've stayed at every hard thing," he said, as though he had been following her thoughts. "Every time something tried to take this place from you, you stayed." "This is my home," she said simply. "I know," he said. "I think that's what I'm looking for." She looked at the fire. "Home," she said. "Something that is worth staying for," he said. The night went on around them and the cattle breathed softly in the dark, and neither of them said anything more for a long while, and the silence between them was the kind that means more than words. They returned to the ranch on Tuesday afternoon with 9 head of new stock, and by the following Thursday, one of the calving cows had delivered twins, which put Helen's count at 75 and closing on the number she needed. She wrote the number 75 in the ledger with a particular firmness of hand, and then closed the ledger and set it back on the shelf and let herself feel, for the first time since October of the previous year, something that was approaching cautious optimism. August noticed the change in her bearing. He did not comment on it directly, but at noon that day, he brought lunch to her in the field instead of waiting at the barn, which was not what they usually did. And when she asked why, he said he had just been passing and thought she might be hungry, and she knew this was almost certainly not the whole reason and did not say so. In the 3rd week of August, Clara Briggs came to visit from her property 4 miles to the east. Clara was 43 and had been Helen's nearest neighbor and the closest thing to a friend that the territory had given her. She arrived in the afternoon on her spotted horse with a jar of preserved plums and the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for an excuse to come and see something for herself. She sat at Helen's kitchen table and accepted coffee and said nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which for Clara was a form of elaborate restraint. "He's a fine-looking man," Clara finally said. "He's a capable worker," Helen said. "Those are 2 different observations, and you made only one of them." Clara stirred her coffee with a spoon. "How long has he been here?" 5 weeks. And he has repaired the east fence, the roof, the northern corral gate, brought up the herd to near market strength, rode 60 miles with me to buy cattle from Ray's in Ockade, and given me reason to believe I will make the October payment to Pratt." Clara looked at her. "Helen." "What?" I asked, and Helen looked at her coffee cup. Clara had known her for 7 years and had held her hand when her father died and had brought food to her door twice in the winter of 1880 without being asked, and could read Helen Talbot better than almost anyone alive. "He is a good man," Helen said, in a different tone than the inventory she had been reciting. "How good?" Clara asked. Helen was quiet for a moment. "He told me the truth about himself on the 2nd evening we had supper. The kind of truth that people usually save much longer, and he didn't do it to impress me. He did it because he was answering a direct question, and he doesn't know how to do that badly." "Lord," Clara said softly, and meant it as the highest kind of compliment. "It's complicated," Helen said. "Everything worth having is. He was hurt by someone in Denver. He's uncertain whether he's the kind of man who can stay." "Did he say that?" "He said it himself. He said he wanted to be, but he wasn't certain he was." "A man who knows his own doubt and says it plainly is a much better prospect than one who is certain of himself and wrong," Clara said. Helen looked at her. "When did you become a philosopher?" "I've been one the whole time. You've been too busy to notice." Clara picked up the jar of plums. "Eat these, you look thin." After Clara left, Helen stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where August was working on the south corral gate, his back to the house, working with the steady, unhurried efficiency that was entirely his own. She watched him for longer than she needed to, and when he turned and looked toward the house, perhaps sensing the attention in the way that people sometimes do, she did not step back from the window. She met his gaze across the yard, and he held it for a moment, and then he nodded once and went back to his work. She turned from the window and let out a long breath. Clara was right. Everything worth having was complicated. She had been uncomplicated for 5 years, and it had kept her safe and solvent and alone. And while alone was not the same as unhappy, she was beginning to understand that they were not as different as she had been telling herself. The next morning she woke before first light and could not get back to sleep, which happened when her mind was working on something in the background without her full permission. She lay in the dark for a while and then gave up and got up and went to the kitchen to start the stove. When she opened the back door to get more wood from the pile, she nearly walked into August, who was coming up the porch steps with an armload of firewood. They both stopped. They were very close in the narrow doorframe, close enough that she could see the sleep that was still in his eyes and the way his hair was uncombed from waking. The morning air was cool and the sky was the pale color it is just before the light comes, and neither of them moved for a second that stretched. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I," she said. He held out the firewood. She took it. Their hands were close on the wood, and then they weren't, and he stepped back and she went inside, and he followed to help start the stove. And they made coffee together in the small kitchen in the early morning dark in a silence that was so comfortable it almost frightened her with how much it did not frighten her. The September roundup went well. August rode the far pastures and the creek bottoms and the rough country at the northeastern edge of the property, where the cattle drifted when they wanted to be lost, and he brought them in with a persistence and a patience that Helen matched on the southern pastures. And by the middle of the month they had counted and cut and marked 81 head, which was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. 81 head. She wrote it in the ledger that evening while August sat at the other end of the table with a piece of leather he was mending, and she could not entirely contain the sound that escaped her, which was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but something from the place where relief and exhaustion and gratitude all lived together. He looked up. "What is it?" 81, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched something soften in his expression that she had not seen there before. "That's enough," he said. "That's enough," she agreed. He put down the leather and sat with his hands on the table and looked at her across the length of it. "Helen," he said, and the way he said her name was different. It was not different in a way she could have described to Clara with precision, but it was different in the way that some things announce themselves before they are said, and she felt it from her throat to her heels. "Don't say something you don't mean," she said softly. "I won't," he said. "That's not something I do." He held her gaze. "I am not uncertain anymore about staying. I was uncertain 6 weeks ago and I told you so because you asked and I owed you the truth, but I'm not uncertain now." She looked at him for a long moment. "August," she said, "I know this is your land and your life, and you have managed it without anyone's help for a long time, and you don't need me here," he said. "I'm not saying it because I think you need me. I'm saying it because he stopped. He pressed his lips together briefly in the manner of a man who is choosing words carefully, not because he doesn't feel the thing, but because the thing matters enough to say correctly. "Because being here, working beside you, knowing you, it has made me want to be someone who deserves a place like this, a life like this, and the wanting doesn't make sense without you in the middle of it." The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, a night bird was calling from somewhere near the creek. The lamp on the table cast its warm circle over them both. She stood up from the table and walked to where he was sitting, and he stood up, and she was looking up at him from just inches away, and she put her hand against his jaw in the gesture of someone who has wanted to do something for weeks and has simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive, and said, "I have been hoping you would say that." And he kissed her in the kitchen of her father's house in the lamplight, with 81 cattle in the pastures outside, and the debt nearly answered, and the stars coming out over the New Mexico territory. And it was the kind of kiss that resolves something and begins something else simultaneously, and both of those things were true. The drive to San Miguel was 4 days. Helen arranged it with a drover named Pete Sandoval, who was a reliable man she had used twice before, and who she trusted with the logistics of moving cattle that distance. She and August rode with the drive, which was not strictly necessary since Sandoval had 3 competent men with him, but she did not trust anyone else entirely with everything she had built this season, and August went because she went, simply and without needing it explained. The drive was long and dusty, and there were 2 nights of rain that made the camping miserable, and one afternoon, when 3 steers decided that south was not the direction they intended to travel, and required an hour of persuasion before they were convinced otherwise. During that hour, August rode with a precision and a quiet authority that Sandoval's men visibly respected, and she watched him work from across the herd with an affection that was no longer something she was managing carefully. On the 3rd night, with San Miguel visible in the distance as a scatter of lights, they sat by the fire after Sandoval and his men had turned in, and August said, Tell me what you want. After October. After the payment is made and the ranch is clear." She looked at the distant lights and thought about the question seriously, because it deserved seriousness. "I want to build the herd properly," she said. "Get it to 120 in 2 years. I want to fix the eastern bunkhouse so it doesn't let in the wind. I want to plant more of the south pasture with the perennial grasses, not just the annuals." She paused. "I want the land to be something my father would recognize as thriving, not just surviving." He was watching her as she talked. "And beyond the ranch," he said. She looked at him. "Are you asking me a specific question?" "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. The cattle were quiet in the dark. "Then ask it specifically," she said. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her across the small fire. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if that is something you would consider. I don't have property or savings beyond my wages and the $62 I've already put into your cattle, but I have." He stopped, and she saw something in him that was not quite vulnerability but was close to it, the particular openness of a man who is not used to asking for things. "I have the genuine desire to work beside you for the rest of my life, and mean every word I've said to you, and continue to mean the ones I haven't said yet. And I understand if that's not enough or if it's too fast, and I would accept that answer without it changing how I work or how I treat you. But I wanted to ask." The fire moved between them. Helen Talbot had been asked to make a lot of decisions in her life. Most of them she had made alone, in the early morning before anyone else was up, in the ledger columns and the practical arithmetic of what was possible and what was not. This decision was different, and yet it was also not complicated at all, which was perhaps the truest indication that it was right. "August Wilcox," she said, "you asked me a question at my fence on the first morning I met you." "I did," he said. "I told you that depended on whether you could drive a nail straight." "You did." "You could," she said, "and the answer to this question is also yes." He stood up and came around the fire to where she was sitting, and she stood to meet him, and he held her face in both his hands and kissed her with a care and a warmth that made the New Mexico night feel warm even where the fire did not reach. And somewhere in the dark, a coyote called from the hills above the valley with its particular wild indifference to human joy, and the joy continued anyway. The cattle sold well at San Miguel. The market was strong. There had been reports of a dry summer further south that had reduced supply from some of the bigger ranches, and the buyers from Albuquerque and Santa Fe were willing to pay more than the previous year's prices. Helen stood at the sale yards in her clean traveling clothes with her ledger and her pencil, and negotiated with a composure and a sharpness that made at least 2 buyers visibly surprised and then visibly respectful. And at the end of the afternoon, she had $461 in cash and a letter of credit for 20 more. $481. She stood outside the sale yard with the money in the envelope inside her coat and the numbers clear in her head, and August came to stand beside her and looked at her and said, "Well, 481, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he made a sound that was something between a laugh and a release of breath, and she laughed too, genuinely and without restraint, which was not something she did often enough, and he looked at her when she laughed like it was the best thing he had seen in a long time. They stayed one night in San Miguel at a boarding house that was clean and decent, and in the morning she sent Sandoval and his men home with their wages and their thanks, and she and August rode north together toward home. On October 12th, 3 days before the deadline, Helen Talbot rode into Cimarron with August Wilcox beside her and walked into the Pratt Banking Company on the main street with $420 in cash in an envelope, counted it onto Delwood Pratt's desk in front of his clerk as a witness, and accepted the receipt that cleared the note in full. Pratt looked at the money. He looked at Helen. He looked briefly at August, who was standing just inside the door with his arms loose at his sides and an expression of comfortable patience. "In full," Pratt said. "In full," Helen confirmed. He signed the receipt with the particular tight movement of a man who has lost something he was fairly confident he was going to win, and she took the receipt and folded it and placed it inside her coat, and said good day with a courtesy that was genuine, because she was a woman who did not waste contempt on people who were simply no longer relevant, and she walked out of the bank into the bright October morning. August fell into step beside her. She unfolded the receipt and looked at it for a moment in the sunlight, the neat official numbers, the signature, the date, and then she folded it again. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like my father's land is my father's land," she said, "and mine. And no one else's." He smiled. The full smile, not the partial one, and she decided in that moment, as she had been deciding in smaller ways for the entire previous 2 months, that she would never tire of seeing it. They walked to the general store and she bought supplies for the winter, and he carried the boxes to the wagon. And before they left Cimarron, she stopped at the office of the Reverend Thomas Hardship, who had been performing marriages in Colfax County since 1874, and who happened to be in his office when she knocked and was surprised and pleased in equal measure. They were married that afternoon, in the Reverend's small office with the October light coming through the window and Hardship's wife as the witness, in a ceremony that was short and unhurried and serious in the way that things are when people say them and fully mean them. August Wilcox said his words with a steadiness and a clarity that she felt in her chest like a held note, and she said hers with equal steadiness. And when Hardship pronounced them married, August took her hand and held it and did not let go. Clara Briggs, when they returned to the ranch that evening, was somehow already at the house. She had the particular gift of being present when she was needed that Helen had come to rely on over the years, with a supper prepared, and a bottle of brandy she had been saving for an occasion worth the saving. "I knew it," Clara said, when she saw them come through the door together, with something changed about the way they moved in the same space, a new ease. "I knew it from the first afternoon I came by and saw him through the kitchen window." "You saw him through the kitchen window and said nothing," Helen said. "I said everything. You simply weren't listening to the parts about the fine-looking man." Clara poured 3 glasses. "Come and eat. You look like you've had quite a day." The supper was warm and the brandy was good, and Clara talked enough for all 3 of them, which was her particular gift, and the evening was the kind of evening that a person returns to later in memory with a completeness of feeling, warmth and laughter, and the particular safety of being in a right place with right people. When Clara finally rode home in the dark, she knew the road well enough that darkness was no obstacle. Helen and August stood together on the porch in the cool October night and looked at the ranch stretched around them in the moonlight. "August," she said. "Yes, thank you." He turned to look at her. "For what specifically?" "For stopping at my fence," she said. "For asking your question." He looked at her with an expression that was warm and direct and completely his. "You could have said no," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "I almost did, out of habit." "What stopped you?" She thought about it. "You looked at my bleeding hand first, before you said anything. Before you even looked at my face properly, you looked at the hand." He was quiet, waiting. "Most people come to this property looking for something from it," she said. "You looked at me and the first thing you saw was that I was hurt." She paused. "That is not a small thing." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the moonlit land of the Talbot ranch spread out before them in the quiet, and she felt the particular piece of a life that has been hard, and is not finished being hard, but has arrived, just now, at a rest between movements. The winter came early that year, as winters sometimes do in the territory, with a cold snap in late October that warned of harder weather ahead. They were ready for it. The bunkhouse was repaired. The hay stores were full. The cattle were in the lower pastures where the wind was broken by the ridge, and the house was warm with the properly working stove and the fixed roof and the added stores from the San Miguel trip. August was a different presence in the house than either a husband or a hired hand alone would have been. He was both and neither, which was to say that he was himself, and himself was someone who woke early and moved quietly and had strong opinions about which wood burned cleanest and an unexpected knowledge of bread making, acquired somewhere in his 9 years of wandering, that he revealed one Sunday morning to Helen's genuine astonishment and delight. "Where did you learn to make bread?" she asked, watching him work the dough with the competence of someone who had done it many times. "A widow in Abilene put me up for a month when my horse went lame and taught me 3 things: how to make bread, how to play euchre, and how to preserve peaches." He looked up. "I've never needed the euchre." She laughed her genuine laugh, and he looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has decided that her laughter is something worth noticing every time it happens. In November she was certain, in the way that women become certain of such things, that she was carrying a child. She told August on a Tuesday evening when the snow was coming in sideways from the north, and the kitchen was warm and they were sitting after supper with the lamp between them. She said it plainly, as was her way. "I believe I'm going to have a baby." August was very still for a moment, and then his expression did something complex and quiet and entirely genuine. Not the performed happiness of a man who thinks he is supposed to be happy, but the real and complicated emotion of a man who has spent years not belonging anywhere, now finding himself with every reason to stay. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked first. She was grateful for this, that his first question was about her. "I'm well," she said, "strong, the same as always." He was quiet for another moment. "A family," he said. "Yes," she said. "Here," he said, "on this land." "That was always my intention," she said. Whether it would come to pass was another matter. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, both of them, her knuckles, with a care and a reverence that made her throat tighten briefly in the way that only happens when something reaches the deepest part of a person, and then he held them and looked at her across the lamp. "I am going to be a very present father," he said. "I know what the other kind looks like and I have no interest in it." "I know," she said, because she did know, because she had understood him well enough by now to know that the way he worked, and the way he spoke, and the way he held his history was all of a piece with the kind of man he was and intended to be. The winter settled in fully through December and January. The snow was heavy that year, and the cattle required daily attention even in the worst of it, and there were 3 nights when they worked side by side in the cold, and the dark, making sure the most vulnerable of the herd were sheltered and watered, coming in after midnight with ice in their hair, and the deep animal tiredness of hard physical work in cold conditions. And she loved those nights in a strange and specific way. The work that mattered, done together, coming home to the warm stove. Clara came through twice in December when the roads allowed and brought preserved goods and news from Cimarron, which included the information that Delwood Pratt had made an offer on the Rays' property in August and been turned down, which gave Helen a satisfaction she felt was entirely appropriate. In February, when the worst of the winter was starting to ease, and the days were lengthening by small amounts that the land seemed to feel before the people did, Helen sat with August at the table one evening and opened the ledger and showed him where the ranch stood. The herd was intact through the winter's 69 head, the die-off modest, and the births through the cold months better than she had hoped for. The hay stores had held. The accounts, without the weight of the Pratt note, showed for the first time in 5 years a genuine positive margin. August looked at the numbers and then looked at the ledger page as a whole, at her handwriting across all the years of entries, the careful tracking of a woman who had kept an exact accounting of everything this land had cost and given, and he understood what he was looking at. "Your father would be proud," he said. She looked at the page. "He would argue with me about the hay storage," she said. "He always thought I kept too much. He said hay that's not used is just wasted space and money. And I always said I would rather have too much and not need it than need it and not have it." She turned a page. "This winter proved me right." "Write that in the margin," August said. She smiled at the ledger, and then she did in her neat, careful hand in the margin beside the hay expenditure entry. "Proved correct, winter 1882-83. HTW." She had not used the new initial before, and when she wrote it she sat with it for a moment. Talbot Wilcox, the joined thing she was now. "It looks right," August said, reading it. "It does," she agreed. In June of 1883, on a morning when the early summer heat was already building, and the meadowlarks were calling from the fence posts all along the south pasture, their son was born in the bedroom of the house her father had built. Clara Briggs was there, as she had been for everything that mattered, and the birth was hard in the way that first births are hard, and Helen was through it with a fierce and particular courage that surprised even herself in the moment, and did not surprise August at all, because he had watched her face down debt and drought and hard winters and a man who wanted her land, and he had never seen her yield. The boy was healthy and loud, and had a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn. He was placed in Helen's arms in the morning light that came through the east window, and she looked at him with an expression that August witnessed from the doorway and knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The complete, unmanaged love of a strong woman for the small new person who had arrived in her care. August came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. "He has your eyes," Clara said from the corner, with the tone of someone who is crying quietly and sees no reason to hide it. "He has his own eyes," Helen said, but she glanced at August when she said it, and the eyes in question were dark and serious, and she privately thought entirely his father's. "What will you name him?" Clara asked. Helen looked at August. They had talked about names through the winter months, testing them against each other, discarding some, holding others. "William," Helen said. "William James Wilcox, for my father and his." August was quiet for a moment. He had not told her his father's name was James. She had found it in a letter she'd come across when she was cleaning out the bunkhouse in December, an old letter from Missouri that he had never answered, and she had put it back where she found it and said nothing, and now he understood that she had been holding it quietly, waiting for the right moment. "Helen," he said. "Is that all right?" she asked. He took her free hand and held it. "It's more than all right," he said. William James Wilcox announced himself to the morning with a sound that carried out through the open window and across the yard, and presumably to the cattle in the south pasture, who were conducting their own morning business in the heat. Clara poured coffee for all of them, including herself, and they sat in the warm morning of the room that had been a bedroom and a sick room, and was now a nursery, and the ranch was alive outside with summer, and the debt was paid, and the land was clear, and the thing that Helen Talbot's father had carried out from Tennessee in a wagon with a 9-year-old girl, and a dream was intact and growing. And the girl herself was now a woman in the middle of a life that had cost everything it had cost, and was worth everything it had cost. And the man beside her had asked one question at her fence a year ago, and the answer had changed both their courses absolutely and permanently, and neither of them would have had it any other way. By the fall of 1883, the herd was at 87 head and growing steadily. August had taken on 2 new hands, young men from the valley, brothers named Tomás and Felipe Garza, who were good workers and good company, and who Clara declared were exactly what the place needed when she came by in September, and found them painting the east side of the barn with a cheerful efficiency that had already transformed its appearance. Helen watched the ranch change through that autumn with a quality of attention that was different from the vigilant watchfulness of the previous years. She had spent 5 years looking at everything on this land as something to protect, to defend, to hold against the constant pressure of difficulty. And now she found herself looking at it differently with the eyes of someone building, someone extending, someone adding to rather than merely preserving. She said this to August one evening when William was asleep in his crib, and the early autumn darkness was settling over the land, and they were sitting on the porch watching the colors leave the sky. "I feel like a different person than I was a year ago," she said. "Are you?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said. "I'm still stubborn. I still argue about the hay." "You were right about the hay," he said. "I concede that absolutely." "I know," she said. "I'm just noting that I haven't changed everywhere." She paused. "But something has changed. I used to come out here in the evenings and look at the land and feel the weight of it, how much it needed, how much it could take. Now I come out here and feel she thought about the word, grateful, just grateful, without the weight underneath it. August was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the last of the color in the western sky, the deep orange fading to the particular blue-purple that this country produced in the transition between day and night. "I know what you mean," he said. "I feel like a different man." He was quiet again. "Not different in that I've changed who I am, different in that I've finally become who I always was." He turned to look at her. "Does that make sense?" "Complete sense," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and William slept inside, and the stars began their slow appearance overhead, and the ranch lay around them in the cooling dark, the cattle in the pastures, the horses in the paddock, the fence lines running clear in all directions, the house her father had built standing solid and warm against the autumn night. They sat together for a long time without speaking, and the silence was the very best kind, the kind that holds everything and needs to hold nothing more. In the spring of 1884, Tomás Garza asked if he and his brother could lease the small cabin on the north section of the property for a modest rent, because they had decided they wanted to stay and put down roots rather than move on when the season changed, which is what young men without attachments often did. Helen said yes without hesitation, and the arrangement worked well for everyone, and the north section began to be worked with a consistency it had not seen since before her father's injury. Clara Briggs found herself a companion in that same spring, a quiet, solid man named Edvard Hagen, who had come from Minnesota with the particular calm of Scandinavian settlers, and who looked at Clara with the kind of steady, warm attention that made Helen immediately approve of him. She told Clara this in private. "How did you know so fast?" Clara asked. "He looks at you the way you look at a fence you've just repaired and know you've done it right," Helen said. Solid and satisfied, and with no desire to change anything about it. Clara laughed until she had to sit down. William was beginning to find his feet by summer of 1884, pulling himself up on anything that would hold his weight and surveying the world from the new elevation, with the expression of a person who has suspected for some time that standing was going to be more interesting than sitting, and has now been proven correct. He had Helen's directness and August's patience in roughly equal measure, which was going to be an interesting combination in about 15 years, August said, and Helen said she was counting on it. By the fall of 1884, the herd stood at 103 head. Helen recorded this in the ledger on a clear October afternoon with William on her lap attempting to assist with the pen, and she looked at the number and felt the full weight of what it meant. 103. Her father had never managed more than 90. The land was not just surviving, it was thriving. She took William to the grave marker on the small rise east of the house where her father and mother were buried side by side, which she did every few months, and she stood there in the October light with her son on her hip and told him, as she always did, who they were and why they mattered, the story of Tennessee and the wagon west and the hard years and the good ones. August found her there after a while, as he always seemed to find her when she needed to be found, and he stood beside her without speaking for a moment, and then he said quietly, 103. He would argue about the hay storage, she said, for the second time in a year. And he would be wrong, August said, for the second year in a row. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He would have liked you, she said. He didn't like most people on first meeting. He would have liked you. I would have worked to earn it, August said. I would have worked very hard. I know, she said. That's exactly why. In the winter of 1884, they discovered Helen was expecting again, and this second pregnancy was easier than the first. She was stronger, and the land was more stable, and the worry that had lived in her bones through the first pregnancy, the worry of the unpaid debt and the insufficient herd and the endless calculation of whether things would come out right, was not there this time. She moved through the winter months with a steadiness that was different from the ferocious, determined steadiness of the years before. It was the steadiness of a person who has passed through the hard part and arrived on solid ground. The second child arrived in July of 1885, on an evening when the summer thunderheads were building over the mountains to the west, and the first distant rumbling of thunder came through the window while Clara worked, and Helen breathed through the last of the labor. The baby came into the world just as the rain began on the roof, a hard, drumming summer rain that the territory needed badly. A girl, this time, small and dark-haired and indignant about the transition from where she had been to where she now was. "What will you call her?" Clara asked from her position of exhausted triumph at the bedside, because Clara had now delivered 2 Wilcox children and considered herself to have a professional interest in the matter of their names. Helen looked at August. They had talked about this too. "Frances," Helen said. "Frances Helen Wilcox." "After your mother," August said. "She would have wanted to meet them," Helen said. "Both of them." She looked at the infant in her arms. "This is the closest I can get." August bent and kissed Helen's forehead, with a gentleness that made Clara look at the window to give them a moment. William, brought in from Clara's supervision to meet his sister, studied her with the serious concentration of a 2-year-old who has recently acquired opinions, and looked up at his father and said, with the certainty of someone who has made up their mind, "Small." "She'll grow," August assured him. William appeared to consider this and accept it as a reasonable trajectory. The years that followed built on each other in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because the land and the territory never offered anyone a life without difficulty, but with the particular texture of a life that is genuinely rooted. Drought in 1886 tested the herd, and they lost 14 head, and had to make hard decisions about water and grazing. And August and Helen made those decisions together at the kitchen table with the ledger between them as it had always been. And they came through it with the ranch intact, and the lesson of those decisions incorporated into how they managed the water rights for the next decade. In 1887, the Garza brothers expanded their cabin, and Tomás married a woman from Santa Fe named Lucinda, who brought with her a knowledge of the territory's complex land laws that proved more than once to be useful when questions arose about grazing boundaries with neighboring properties. Felipe remained cheerfully single and universally liked, and was godfather to Frances at her church christening, a role he took with a seriousness that touched Helen. The year William turned 5, Helen found him sitting on the fence watching the cattle with the focused, assessing gaze of a small person who has decided to understand a thing, and August came and stood beside her at the kitchen window, and they both watched him, and neither said anything for a long moment. "He's going to know every inch of this land," Helen said. "He already knows more of it than I did at 20, August said. She smiled. "He asked me yesterday how we decide when a calf is ready to be weaned." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," she said. "I always tell him the truth." "I know," August said. "It's one of the things I love most about you." She turned from the window to look at him. He said things like this with the same unforced straightforwardness he said everything else, and she had never stopped finding it remarkable, the way he brought love into language simply and without performance, as though it were just one of the true things in the world alongside the weather and the price of cattle and the particular way the winter light fell over the mountains in the late afternoon. "August," she said. "Yes. I love you." "I know," he said. "I love you too." William, from his fence post, called in to ask if there were any biscuits, and the ordinary beautiful life continued around them and through them like the creek through the northeast pasture, year-round and reliable and entirely their own. By 1889, the New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, still years away, as it turned out, but the conversation was in the air and in the newspapers that came through Cimarron, and the changes that came with territorial growth were reaching even the ranches in Colfax County. New settlers were arriving, the railroad had pushed further into the territory, and the world was, as worlds do, moving and changing around the fixed point of the Talbot Ranch. Helen kept careful notes of the changes. She went to the county seat when land matters were being discussed, and she spoke clearly and without apology when the interests of her ranch were at stake. And she was listened to, partly because of the reputation she had built over many years and partly because August stood behind her and slightly to the left at county meetings, with the quiet presence of a man who is there to back up someone who does not actually need backing up but who appreciates having it anyway. Delwood Pratt had retired from active banking by 1887, and the note that had once governed so much of Helen's life and thought was a distant memory with no power at all. She had kept the receipt in the bottom of the cedar box on the bedroom shelf, not as a trophy, but as a record, the proof of a day that had been difficult and had been survived and had led, through a chain of choices and chances, to everything that came after. The ranch by 1889 stood at 140 head, had a full-time workforce of 4 including the Garza brothers, maintained fence lines that were entirely sound for the first time in Helen's memory, and produced enough from the San Miguel market each fall to meet all expenses and continue the gradual, careful improvements that she and August planned each winter at the kitchen table. William was 7 and could ride adequately, and had decided that he wanted to understand bookkeeping, which Helen thought was perhaps the most personally gratifying development she had witnessed since the birth, and she began teaching him the ledger system with the seriousness of passing down a craft. Francis was 4 and had the particular independence of a child who has an older sibling to learn from and does not intend to learn anything slowly. She followed August around the property with a small, devoted persistence and had appointed herself the official assistant for any task he undertook, which he accepted with a patience and a delight that was entirely genuine. In the fall of 1889, they rode out together, all 4 of them, Helen and August and William and Francis, on a pony she had recently been given, and was managing with more confidence than could reasonably be expected of a 4-year-old, to the northeast pasture, where the year-round creek ran between its banks in the golden autumn light. This was the pasture that Pratt had wanted, the pasture that made the ranch more valuable, that had been at the center of the long pressure of the debt. The water ran clear and cold over the stones, and the cottonwoods along its banks had gone yellow, and the cattle moved through the grass along the water with the ease of animals who have everything they need. William had been told the story of Delwood Pratt and the October payment in age-appropriate terms, and he turned to his mother with the grave seriousness of a 7-year-old who has processed significant information. "So he wanted this part," William said. "He wanted all of it," Helen said, "but this part most." William looked at the creek, at the cattle, at the yellow trees. "That's ours," he said, with a simple, certain territorial pride that was at once entirely childlike and entirely appropriate. "That's ours," August agreed. "Always," Frances asked from her pony with the tone of a person who wants all the facts. Helen reached over and tucked a strand of hair back under her daughter's hat. "As long as we work it and love it," she said. "Yes." Frances considered this and nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has determined that the terms are acceptable. They stayed at the creek for a while in the October afternoon, the water moving over the stones, the light coming through the yellow cottonwood leaves in pieces and patterns, the cattle grazing, and the 4 of them belonging to this place entirely, rooted in it through the long labor and love that roots people to places, which is the only thing that ever really does. Helen looked at August across the heads of their children, and he looked back at her, and what passed between them needed no words because they had said all the words at the fence on the first morning, at the fire on the road to Ocate, across the kitchen table in the lamplight, in the Reverend's office in October of 1882, through every long winter and every full-stocked fall and every ordinary evening on the porch, and the words had built this, and this was everything. He reached out and took her hand, and she took his, and the creek ran between its banks in the golden afternoon, and the land stretched away in all directions to the mountains, and the Talbot Ranch, which was also now the Wilcox Ranch, which was also simply home, lay at peace in the autumn of the territory that would one day be a state but was, Just now, this beautiful, difficult, nourishing, permanent, and entirely beloved place. And the drifter who had stopped his horse at the fence and asked if she wanted help had stopped drifting. And the woman who had been holding the land alone for 5 years was not alone anymore. And both of them had found in the other exactly the thing they had been looking for without knowing precisely what it looked like until it arrived. Which is the way of most things worth finding? Which is the way it is?